my role here is as a double-barrel outside agitator. And that is, I have been deeply interested in the New York crime decline since roughly the middle of it, when both Rick Rosenfeld and I were trying to do work on the rather puzzling general crime decline in the United States in the 1990s. And in a sense, I'm calling myself an outside agitator because my interest in New York is in terms of what it tells us about crime control issues and about the nature of urban crime more generally. New York is, I think, special statistically. I do not think that it's special organically. And I think that something spectacular has gone on in this city that should be studied for its impact on a set of larger American problems that Jeremy talked about. So, what I want to do here and what I'm doing in the book is essentially using New York City as a case study, but with ambitions for explaining larger and more general phenomena. New York interests me as a laboratory for new insights on both urban crime and its control. Okay, we start with numbers. And these numbers are official crime statistics, more about that later. But they're presented in a peculiar fashion. Usually you'll have people talking about what a percentage increase is or what a percentage decrease is in a crime rate. This one uses the largest window that was available during the period that I was finishing the book, which is 1990 to 2009. And it expresses the official crime rate in New York City for the 7 traditional index crimes. But in each case, it just tells you what 2009 crime was as a percentage of its rate per 100,000 in 1990. And what it documents is huge crimes, drops. Homicide in 2009 is 18% of what homicide was in 1990. Robbery is 16%. Burglary is 14% of its 1990 volume. It's a pretty broad statistical decline in a lot of senses. First of all, across a lot of very different crimes. Secondly, across a lot of very different boroughs. Because New York City is not one of the major cities in the United States, but if you separate the 4 major boroughs, it's 4 of the 7 largest cities in the United States. And they're separate to some extent by geography. They're very different economically, and they're very different demographically. And the drop is general across all of the boroughs. Okay, so they're very big drops, and we're going to come back to these statistics at the very end of my peroration. Only this time I'm going to give you a different graphic representation of the same darn numbers. We'll talk about why. But the first problem that we have is, of course, are these drops real? Police have a sort of a combination of functions problem when it comes to crime statistics. They have a vested interest in looking good, and they also have control over the data. That is generally a dangerous issue in the generation of crime data, and it has been over almost a century in the United States, an issue which is also famously explored. First major project, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it this morning, was figuring out whether the decline was real. And the way that I tried to figure it out is to construct independent indicators to the extent that they could be found. That is to say, data sets that the police didn't control when generating crime statistics to see whether you get the same patterns over time. There were 3 of those that I want to talk about here, and then I want to mention some survey research as well. The first figure I want to show you is for homicide. What this figure shows is trends over time in New York City of 2 different measures of intentional homicide. One of them is the police statistics, and the other is the Department of Health vital statistics. The correlation between the 2 over time is 0.999. End of story on homicide statistics. The police homicide statistics as an indication of relative drop over time. I'm not saying they always get things right in 1990 and always get things right in 2009. What I am saying is that there certainly wasn't a change in evident accounting for homicides that would explain any of that 82% decline that was on the first slide. Okay. The second crime that we investigated, and this is one that Amanda Geller has also been doing a fair amount of work on lately, is the crime of auto theft. And auto theft in New York is the Guinness Book of World Records. The auto theft rate in New York in 2009, if you use the official statistics, was 6% of the auto theft rate in 1990. I've been in this business for a long time, and I've never seen a drop like that in a social setting that was not drastic change. Okay. Now, auto theft is also a situation where comprehensive insurance, not liability insurance, but insurance for losses such as theft, as well as collision insurance, is generally very widely held. And so what the figure that you see up there does is compare in 1990, in year 2000, and in 2009, trends in insurance losses that were reported by a crime bureau, which the insurance industry uses for the city of New York. That's on the right-hand side, and the official auto theft crime statistics. And again, I'm not interested in whether the police were getting auto theft right in 1990, or getting it right in 2009, or what their error margin was in either year. What I'm interested in is whether there is a bias, and particularly a magnification, in the official statistics decline that comes because of a change over time in reporting. And what you get there is that in the first 10 years of the New York experience, there is what is almost identical in terms of the insurance and the police statistics. In the second 9 years of this 19-year time series, there is what I would characterize as a slightly smaller drop in the insurance theft rate, loss rate, as there was in the New York City police theft rate. Now, even that, I would say, first of all, looks to me like a substantial confirmation of the official statistics. And secondly, may be explained by the fact that the very changes in crime rate that we're talking about may have also changed the dynamic of insurance coverage. And that is to say that it really makes less sense to buy theft insurance unless it's a lot cheaper in 2009 than it did in terms of your loss odds in 1990. Maybe we can get back to that. The third independent measure I want to show you is not quite as independent. There are two lines on this graph. The dark line is the official robbery rate in New York City. The dotted line is a supplemental homicide report count by year of the situations where a different office in the New York City Police Department estimates that there was a robbery killing. And the idea here is to use robbery killings as an index of the general robbery rate to see whether it has different periodicity. And in one place, it does have different periodicity. What you find is that the drop from 1990, this data goes back earlier than that, the drop from 1990 in SHR robbery killings is actually greater than the drop in robberies over the 19 years. But that the reason for that may be that while killings went up tremendously in the period from 1985 to 1990, the officially reported robberies didn't go up as much. That is the solid line in the first years of this time series. One of the things that may be telling us is that perhaps for every 100 robberies in New York City during the late 1980s, because of changes in guns or because of changes in the nature of robbery, that robbery was a more lethal event per 100 reported robberies. In that case, the differential time pattern wouldn't indicate any change in reporting. But the other thing that it could indicate is that during the period of a sharp increase in the general robbery rate, the police department back in the late 80s was being a little bit less accurate in making actual robbery reports into robbery statistics. But if so, the impact in terms of looking at the trends over time and how official statistics relate to real trends would be ironically exactly the opposite of what our suspicions are. And that is to say that the underreporting then would actually mildly understate the robbery rate in terms of its decline. But when you've got an 84% robbery rate decline, my inclination would be to assume that the changes in the early 90s were changes in real lethality rather than changing in reporting. But either way, the robbery decline that you see from a 2009 perspective looks genuine. I want to add here that for both robbery and burglary, and for a shorter time period, because it ends in 2003, Rick Rosenfeld and Janet confirm the slope of the trends that we see in the official statistics. For those crimes, and they are the most serious crime, homicide, the one with the biggest drop, auto theft, and the quintessential fear crime, street crime, robbery, everything that we know about New York City crime suggests that the decline is real. Okay, but this is a group of criminologists. So what we've got to figure out is what caused that huge decline. And I have bad news. The bad news is that more than half of the decline in total crime in New York City can't be tied either to particular policies in New York or to particular New York phenomena for a simple reason. And that is, it was the tailwind of a national decline that was pervasive in the 1990s and explains actually slightly more than half of the aggregate statistical decline in New York. What that does, the good news is that I think that the pattern in New York, certainly up to 2007, and somewhat less dramatically through 2009, has substantial differences between New York City and the national pattern. And the search in the research study that the book reports is really for that New York difference, a little bit less than half the 1990 to 2009 decline. And the obvious suspect for explaining anything distinctively New York in the pattern of decline is the New York police. But here the problem is that the police changed in so many ways that it is very difficult to even characterize what the police variables are that you want to look at. The first thing that happened is that New York City added a lot of cops. The second thing that happened is that they got a lot differently organized. And the era of CompStat, or CompStat, I'm sorry. And the third thing that happened is that the police got an awful lot more aggressive on the streets. So those are three general headings. Did this reduce crime? Well, in the aggregate, the book argues that measuring this isn't easy and it isn't precise, but in the aggregate, I think it's possible. And the strategy that I use is to take away that national decline that has nothing to do with what the New York City police were doing by subtracting the average big city's decline. That's step one in this process of elimination. Step two is then to remove any drops that may have been the result of other big changes in New York City. Anybody who's walked down 42nd Street and who remembers 1977 will know that there have been changes physically and demographically in the city and economically in the city that may also be important for their impact on crime. The one New York shift that the book argues qualifies for special exclusion in trying to figure out by a process of elimination what difference cops made was the drop in high crime victimization minorities in one of New York's 5 boroughs and one of its major boroughs, Manhattan. Between 1990 and 2007, the African American population of the borough of Manhattan declined 30%. priced out of Manhattan, a lot of the rest of us. Okay. But none of the other three major boroughs lost high victimization populations. African American populations were generally essentially stable. Hispanic populations increased. So one way of estimating police effects is by comparing the median non-Manhattan borough crime decline. That is New York City, but excluding Manhattan from the median calculation because other things might have been going on there. And comparing that with the median drop in the rest of the 10 major cities. And this is what you get when you do that. What you get is a pattern of New York City crime being very differently lower depending upon which of the index crimes we're talking about. Larceny and assault have trivial differences from the national pattern. Homicide and rape have, and remember, these are percentages of 1990 levels. So you say, oh, homicide, 12% of 1990 homicide, that isn't much. Remember that every killing in 2009 is 18% of New York City's 1990 rate, and the 12% presumptive police impact is therefore about 2/3 of the amount of homicide that's left in the city. The magnitude of the estimate for rape is quite similar. But for three other crimes, the estimated percentage of the 1990 base that is police attributable as a decline are much bigger. 32% of the robberies, 32% of the burglaries, and 21% of the auto thefts. Now, 21% of auto theft, that doesn't sound a lot. Remember, that's 21% of 1990 auto theft. That turns out to be 4 times as much auto theft as New York now experiences, that one estimates has been a police effect. The other thing I want to say about that is that the 3 crimes with the biggest impact, robbery, burglary, and auto theft, are also the 3 crimes where street or street access context would suggest that changes in policing might have more marginal impact. So there's a fit there, and there is a slight fit also with homicide and rape, which are mixtures of known and acquaintance and unknown crimes, and where you would expect a mixed pattern. The only offense that doesn't fit in that portrait is assault, where you would expect somewhat more of a police effect than you actually get. Okay. It's easy in theory to kind of isolate police effects in the aggregate. What's very difficult is to get precise. The numbers jump around depending upon what your end year is. And that's simply one of the things, one of the limits that you're going to have to live with. But the second limit, in terms of the kinds of sound bites that statistical science would like to give to people, is, okay, what is it that the police did that might have had these effects? And there the problem is that too many things happened at the same time. There were a kitchen sink full of changes in New York. Now the police would like to tell you that all of them contributed. But there's no science supporting that. Okay, there's more cops, up 40% in the 1990s, and we can talk a little bit about those statistics. Former Chief Bratton told me that number was high, but I've done the arithmetic and it was up 40%. But then, after 2000, the police department dropped 4,000 officers. So you have two different eras. And one way, you might want to investigate whether it was the throw rate of cops, the more cops on the street that were tremendously important, is to compare the New York City advantage over the period when the force was growing tremendously with the New York City advantage over other cities during the period when it was shrinking. You might find fiscal crisis here to be a good setting for a natural experiment. Well, if that's the natural experiment, then on one basis here, and what this does is simply take New York City's relative performance to the other 9 of the 10 largest cities in the United States over 1990 to 1999 or 2000. That is the expansion era. And compare the New York City during the reduction era. And crime dropped more in the 90s in New York than it did over the more recent era. But of course, crime dropped everywhere more in the 1990s than it did in the more recent era. When you look at the New York City estimated comparative advantage, it's identical during the expansion and the contraction era. Does that mean it was not the increase in cops during the 1990s that was driving the New York City advantage? And the answer here is not necessarily. Manpower was still up, and up significantly, more than 20%, which is more than other cities during the entire period. Police productivity was probably up. And manpower impacts may last a long time. And then there is one other interesting little issue. This is measuring cops per 100,000 citizens, which is one natural way of talking about police density. And the 4,000 fewer cops in an expanding population was a real decline. But what if you were to measure workload adjustment by saying, well, what happened to the number of police officers per 100 homicides in New York or any of the particular boroughs? And the answer there is that, measured by that number, the police presence went up even during that second era because crime was dropping more than police officers were dropping. So you can neither confidently exclude nor can you clearly implicate sheer manpower as a force. I do think that the sort of Steve Levitt, oh, it's all number of cops argument that was made in 2004 is pretty clearly disproved by the pattern over the period since 2000. But the more complicated possibilities are pretty ambiguous. Now, the gospel according to Zimring. What do I think worked? What may have worked? What we don't know about? And what we do know about. And I want to spend very little time on this list now. Not because it's unimportant. I think some of these questions are very important. But because I'm not going to be telling the people in this room much that they don't already know. The two police tactics that were part of for the organizational change in New York City that I am almost certain were major contributors to the crime decline were so-called hotspot strategies, and overlapping with that, the New York City Police Department's destruction of public drug markets. And in each case, my conclusion that we know the strategy was effective is based on a combination of New York and external analysis. We know that New York City went into the hotspots business big time, and that they did it with energy and extraordinary aggressiveness, and they did it pretty well. But we can't prove hotspots works with only New York data. But we don't have to, because there are other cities where hotspots has been rigorously evaluated and proven to work. And so I'm piggybacking on what we found out in Atlantic City and elsewhere to project that hotspots also work well in New York City. The destruction of public drug markets as a proven contributor is based on something different. And that is that there is one indicator, which is drug-related homicides in the SHR list, where the drop in drug-related homicides was even bigger than the general homicide drop, and significantly bigger. And that I'm using as a public drug market specific indicator that what the city was doing there was a proven success. The probable successes, CompStat. I think it worked, but you can't prove it. There was no group that wasn't brushing with Crest in New York City. So you can say, well, it distinguished New York from other cities during that period, but lots of other things did. It probably worked. The gun priorities and programs probably worked. But of course, they've been a priority long before the Dinkins expansion of the force. There have been some pretty good evaluations of gun programs which have shown strong results. Tracy and Jeff, who are in this room, did one in Chicago. Why can't I simply transplant that in the same way that I did with hotspots? Well, because that's not what the New York City police were doing. So that simply indicates that guns can be important in lethal violence. Not a surprise to most of the people in this room. But it doesn't indicate that what New York City was doing specifically was proven. It probably worked, but we don't have rigorous tests yet. Okay. Let's get to the big don't know. Street aggressiveness, which was one of the major characterizations, major changes in New York City. There were in 2010 581,000 stops and frisks reported in the system. There was a huge increase in misdemeanor arrests. This kind of aggressiveness was a very substantial element in some of the police strategies that I've already told you I thought worked. Hotspots was very aggressive policing. The destruction of public drug markets was not done with Emily Post etiquette. So doesn't that prove that that kind of aggressiveness works? Well, not York City was using in its street policing added value to hotspots, added value to the public drug market destruction program. And to the question of whether it was value added in crime prevention in New York, there are no rigorous tests yet in the city. And there are no rigorous tests likely in this city of that issue in the future. Okay, we can come back and chat about that. But again, I want to be an outside agitator here and go to three big picture implications and provoke you. This figure is absolutely astonishing. The solid line is incarceration of adults in New York City over the years 1990 to 2009. The dotted line is rates of incarceration in the rest of the United States during the same period. New York City, which had incarcerated very energetically in the 1980s, had at its peak, which was 1997, only 11% more people locked up in jails and prisons than it had in 1990. And then it started dropping. By the end of this period, 2009, there were 28% fewer people locked up in prison from New York City, in jail in New York City, than were locked up in 1990. Well, but of course you tell me, crime was going down. Remember, crime was going down in the rest of the United States all during the 1990s too. And during the 1990s, incarceration went up in the rest of the United States 49%, and it kept going up. By the end of this period, 2009, there's a 2-to-1 difference in trend adjustment. New York City is down 28%. The rest of the country is up 65%. Now, one of the thought experiments that might be interesting here for big picture is what if these patterns had been reversed, and we were having a conference about why crime went down in New York City. If these patterns had been reversed, then the natural explanation for an American policy universe which has been dedicated to imprisonment would have been prison did it. But it was the group that didn't brush with crests that had half the cavities here. What's going on here? More specifically, we have assumed in this country that there was only one option to reduce crime with high-rate repeat offenders. And the reason we've assumed that is that there was only two conditions with high-rate offenders. You either lock them up, and this creates incapacitation, or they will continue to offend. Under those circumstances, if you look at this figure, New York City didn't happen. Where have all the criminals gone? Did they move to New Jersey? Well, Newark is complaining, but the answer is no. Population issues were quite stable in 3 of those 4 major boroughs. So the first thing that you have to comprehend about New York City is that it was substantial crime reduction without mass incarceration increments. Or, where have all the criminals gone? This is just some money issues. It turns out that if you were to compare New York City's real incarceration, which is 43,000 in 2009, with what it would have been if the national average trend had been adhered to, which is 108,000, you've got 58,000 fewer people locked up. If the same unit of government was paying for police as was paying for prisons, and it isn't, that unit of government would have already saved more money than it's invested in the police expansion because of the prison difference. That's one of two sort of rhetorical charts. We can skip over it here. I want to talk about a second lesson from New York City, which is a lot of fun. The solid line there is drug overdose death rates in New York City, cocaine and heroin, essentially, over time. And what I want to say about it is that while it fluctuates somewhat, it's relatively stable. And I'm using that as one of several indicators the book looks at of trends in illegal drug use. Cocaine and heroin use in New York City and sale and availability and price didn't change much. And it certainly didn't change in ways that it didn't also change in other big cities. The other two lines here, the ones that approach zero rather quickly, are drug-related homicides. And they go down more than 90%. The police count them in two different ways. There are real problems with the statistics. But it is a much, much bigger drop. Okay, what's going on here, and why should it be important to a larger American debate? The large American debate that we all remember, don't we, around the war on drugs, was between the sort of the right-wing legalist school that said, look, the only way to reduce drug violence and our drug problems is to reduce the level of drug use. William Bennett was the drug czar, famous for that. And then there were sort of the wets in this argument. And what the wets were talking about was harm reduction. Say, no, look, let's see what your problems are. If people are getting HIV, maybe you want to give them clean syringes. If there are problems with regard to violence, you try and address those problems. I think the book can prove that what New York City did, first of all, and it was the police department that did it, was embrace harm reduction rather than drug war legalism as what it was doing. The largest increase in police manpower assignments during the 1990s was in narcotics. It went up 137% between 1990 and 1999. And then, despite the fact that it was still a bigger police force, once the drug markets had been destroyed, the number of narcotics unit people was actually less by 2006 than it had been in 1990. So I think that there are two statistically interesting patterns with regard to drug policy. One of them is that what New York City's police efforts managed to do is to win the war on drug violence, those homicides, without winning the war on drugs. Rather steady use and steady and low price of these drugs. And what was interesting about that is that the priorities of this police department not simply their differential achievement, but their goals were to reduce drug violence rather than to have an all-out war on drugs. Well, that's a stunning sort of victory, but it is also an aspect of New York City policy and policy impact that has received zero attention. I think it should achieve more attention. Let's assume for a moment that homicide will never go any lower in New York City than it did in 2009. Under those circumstances, what we now know is sort of the rock bottom, the fixed nature of homicide. It was about 18% of its 1990 level. Well, by implication, and now we go up to the bar chart that's dark, that meant that what turned out to be the variable part of New York crime was 82% of all its homicide. That if you don't change the city's population, you don't change the city major physically, you don't change the nature or economic distribution thing, you still can have an 82% variance in criminal homicide, and 84% in robbery, and 94% in auto theft. So that in retrospect, you've had a tremendous amount of variance on the downside, but variance as well. And you've had it under the context of fewer people being incarcerated. So you have fewer people being locked up, and safety crime is down by more than 80%. Where have all the criminals gone? Well, here are two different time series on recidivism rates of high-rate offenders. The solid line that goes from 1985 to 2006 is of people who were sent to the prisons in New York City and released in 1985. What percentage of them were reconvicted of a felony within the first 3 years after release? That percentage starts at 1985 at 21%. And as crime increases in New York City, the percentage of the high-rate offenders reconvicted of a felony in the next 3 years also increases from 21% to 28% of the released cohort. I'm using that as a measure of the level of criminal activity. Certainly if the police are getting better, it's a minimum level of criminal activity. And then what happens from 1990 to 2006, because this will end in 2009, 3 years after release, is that the percentage of this release cohort that is reconvicted of a felony within 3 years goes from 28% to 10%. If that's a measure of individual crime rates, the individual crime rates of these folks drops 64% in 19 years. Okay. Crime rates vary a lot in New York City. And they vary a lot more than some of us who've been in this business for a long time. Hi, Al. Hi, Frank. Hi, Phil. Ever thought was possible. We used to have a lot of task forces on habitual offenders and career criminals and criminal careers. I think it's time to call the game back to look at some new data in this context. Or the way I put it that amused Marcus Felsen was maybe Marcus Felsen was right. Or, more particularly, that crime rates vary because urban crime is more situational and contingent than a lot of us ever thought. Let's go back to what we thought about police 15, 20 years ago. David Bailey wrote a book on police, and he starts out by saying, look, you know, police don't really have serious impact on violent crime rates. They can't prevent it. Why did we think that? Career criminal again. You can send police to 125th Street, but the police will only, the criminals will go to 138th. Or you can blanket the place on Tuesday, so the robberies will take place on Thursday. That's a very good theory if your model of crime and offenders is right. But if there's this much variability, what I think New York's data may be telling us is that if you prevent a robbery on Tuesday or at 125th Street, you're preventing a robbery for 2011. That the features that lead to crime or not are so much more situational and contingent than we thought. Now that is very good news, not just for police, but for any mechanisms of prevention which are invested in the changeability of individual behavior. Probation supervision, dare I say it? Midnight basketball. Remember the idea was, so they're playing basketball on Friday, they'll rob on Saturday. If they're playing basketball on Friday, there may be one less robbery in 2011. However, there's one strategy where that degree of variability at the individual level is very bad news, and that is incapacitation. Because its cost effectiveness goes down with the criminal activity of the people that you're locking up because you're absolutely positive they're going to keep doing it. And so the explanation for the stunning reductions in crime in New York in the context of lesser incarceration may again be on the situational and contingent nature of street crime as we know it. Or is that only in New York? No, it isn't. I want to make two research notes and then sit down and let you folks fight about the details. The first thing that I want to tell you about the Zimring book is that it by no means occupies the field of conceivable empirical research that we could do on the crime reduction in New York. You don't have to worry about that. For one thing, we have some pretty good observational studies on what happened to crime. But we have very few observational studies of how people did or didn't change the way they were living their lives. That I'd really love to go back to 1990 and start paying more attention to what's going on the street and following people around. Because what we know statistically is what happened, and what we don't know is how it happened. How many changes? Yeah, I know situational and contingent are wonderful words, but what the heck do they mean at street level? and which situational elements, and what contingent features. Okay, we know what happened, but we don't know how it happened. Is it too late to do good observational work to capture these marginal changes? Well, it may be too late in New York. If 18% of homicide in 1990 is really close to dead minimum, if the changes, or the big changes, have stopped happening here, then observational study now will be limited. Okay, but now the good news about observational studies, which we desperately need. What makes the New York experience from 1990 to this morning when I finished my coffee most important is that New York City is not unique. New York City is representative of urban crime. The situational and contingent features that I'm talking about don't stop at the border of the Bronx. If they're representative of urban crime, observational studies can happen elsewhere. One of the things that we're finding out now, and particularly I have to say with some significant changes in Los Angeles, is that New York is becoming less unique because there are some places, Los Angeles is the one I know best, which seem to be catching up. That variability phenomenon is general. And what that does is it enables us now to have a second chance to study a process. We now know that what happened was tremendously important. And we know that it's worth a very serious scientific effort on the part of the people in this room to find out how it happened and how those lessons can be used both for more effective crime control and more humane crime control simultaneously in the American urban future. It's a very, very difficult task, and I wish you all the best of luck. And so.
Lunch is scheduled from 12 to 1. What I'd like us to do is go over that 12 o'clock mark by at least 10 minutes so that we have at least 15, 20 minutes for discussion, and then we can continue that discussion informally over lunch. So, the floor is open. There are microphones around, and please use a mic so everyone can hear you. And I'll do the same.
And please tell me who you are, because if you're back of the room, I can't see you.
David, go ahead, and then Al.
Okay. David Greenberg from NYU. Frank, in the slides when you showed us what proportion of the drop in New York could be attributed to the police, it wasn't clear to me whether this was simply what you got when you eliminated other factors and then attributed to the police, or whether you had measures of police action and did a statistical analysis to get those numbers.
Okay. It is only the former. And that is to say that there are other places. It's very easy to get extremely detailed records of police personnel moves. And that's very important to use as an independent variable in a lot of space. But to get careful historical records of what police were doing on the street historically is not only beyond my capacity there, but good luck, and you're doing it too. You can't do that retrospectively. So it is a process of elimination. There was a great light beer commercial of about 20 years ago where a couple of defensive linemen said that their strategy for getting the ball carrier, Bubba Smith, He said, what I go in is I tackle the entire backfield, and then I remove the people without the ball until I find the ball carrier and put him down. That's the process of elimination. And essentially for that, it was you try and control the general decline. And the problem with regression analysis at the individual city level is that there's so much we don't know about what was driving crime down in the 1990s, so that the only controls that are possible there, until the science gets tremendously better than it is now, is to compare New York to other cities. And once you've done that, then the problem is, yeah, but there are other changes that took place, principally in Manhattan. So what I do is I take the non-Manhattan median for New York City, and I subtract the median big city rate. And that gives us the best guess I can come to the magnitude of the New York City police effect for Manhattan as well, because I'm not assuming that all the changes in Manhattan were attributable to its huge economic growth or to its demographic changes. What I'm assuming, however, is that they have overstated what would be police effects. And the way to know what the police-only effects would be in Manhattan is to see what happened in Queens and Brooklyn, and mostly the Bronx. And if I were looking for the miracle borough of crime decline in New York City without any changes in urban quality of anywhere near that magnitude, it would be the Bronx.
Al?
Al Bloomstein, Carnegie Mellon University. That was just a very impressive story. I was particularly intrigued by that drop in drug-related homicides, with not much change in the drug overdoses. To what extent was there an explicit policy change in the drug war itself? To what extent was, in the face of a major growth in marijuana arrests during that period, and were the police told to do something differently, because it was clear that that homicide rate went down markedly, and to what extent was there a major reduction in the use of incarceration for drug offenders, which now comprises still over 20% of state prison population. So, I mean, it sounds like a major transition in the drug war in New York that wasn't replicated elsewhere, and that is that a major opening in AQ to how we replicate something about New York?
Okay, this is not going to be a short answer, in part because I skipped over some stuff which I want to be very explicit on in terms of New York City policing. There was a huge increase in marijuana, public street marijuana arrests in New York City that had absolutely nothing to do with drug control. These are pretextual arrests, as most misdemeanor street arrests were in New York City. And what it was, and Jack Maple wrote the book on it, literally in 1999, was using it as a pretext to get fingerprints to find out if there were more warrants there. It was preventive street, it was the plus on stop and frisk. It had nothing to do with marijuana. The police didn't care about marijuana. But what you're saying is, can we assume that the police were self-consciously in the harm reduction business? And I think that the answer to that is yes, from the huge manpower swings. We've got lots of different measures of drug use in New York. There was some dip in the cocaine use of younger people in the middle, late 1990s, and then a drift back up. There were, I mean, the one thing that the war on drugs did that wasn't dreadful was it created a lot of different drug use indicators. You had the ADAM program for urines until, but interrupted late in the 90s. You have emergency room mentions called DAWN. You have treatment for drug dependencies, hospital releases. And by all of them, drug use is either stable or somewhat up by the mid first decade of year 2000 on. What you also have is the New York City Police Department, which is now 22% larger than it was in 1990, having fewer people, first increasing more than doubling the number of cops in the narcotics unit, and then cutting it by more than half. That seems to me to be the best measure of where the police priority was. They wanted to make the streets safe, and the destruction of public drug markets did that. It also reduces drug homicides for an interesting reason. If you and I are selling drugs, Al, in a public drug market, we're both going to want the best corner. And I can't sue you if you got there first, so I bring a gun. If you're selling out of your apartment and I'm selling out of my apartment, we don't cross guns about that. Now, I go further than that in the book, and I've got a lot of statistics to do it. The idea of broken windows policing in New York, or order maintenance, was myth from day one. That a lot of things that look like order maintenance, like all those marijuana arrests, were pretextual arrests as part of street crime control. So what you really want to do is to find something that would be a public order crime, but a lousy way to control street crime and see what happened with it. I got one. Prostitution. Prostitution. Now, 70% of the people who are arrested for prostitution in the United States, in other cities, are women. And for that reason, not going to be a good way to rouse burglars or robbers to do that. Well, the peak year for prostitution arrests in New York City over the period 1990 to 2009 was 1991. And actually, there never was a peak. But those arrests have been drifting down. The Vice Squad, while the Narcotics Squad was more than doubled, the Vice Squad was cut in half. They put some people back in it very late in this time series. There is no indication that the major structural priorities of street policing in New York were ever anything called broken windows, and there are some other indications that it was the opposite. Broken windows was a strategy where you went to marginal areas of the city that were in danger of decline. Did you concentrate police resources on the highest crime areas? Well, what Wilson and Kelly said is, oh no, those are probably hopeless. Hotspots is the opposite of that. But what New York City did was hotspots. What I can tell you was the evidence of the self-consciousness of the harm reduction priority for the police is what they did with their own manpower. I have a harder time using incarceration statistics on drugs with any confidence as an indication of police priorities for 2 or 3 reasons. One of them is that near the very end of this time series, the infamous Rockefeller drug laws did get changed. And that will have some impact, particularly statewide, in prison stuff. Secondly, most of the police management and prevention efforts that I'm talking about here were, as far as the police designing them were concerned, almost wholly independent of what happens later in the system. It was a self-contained set of police priorities. Yes, we will arrest people. Yes, we will make felony cases. But that was never a deep priority. So that means that the further removed from the police-only domains of organization and priority you get, the less likely you can interpretively assume that it's police that are the cause of the changes in the dependent variables that you're observing. End of very long answer. Go ahead.
Hi, Susan Tucker, OSF and Department of Probation, New York City. You talked about this harm reduction approach for the police. Have you, or has anybody looked at the impact of a really robust ATI community here, working with people on probation, coming out of prison, other kind of alternatives to incarceration programs on the crime decline?
Well, this is the wonderful advantage of being an outside agitator. I can answer that question yes and no, but there's a lot more no than yes to the question. What the book argues is that any people-changing strategies, if they're plausible, will have much more leverage because of what we now know about the situational and the contingent. And I would definitely include the phenomena that you're talking about as those that look a lot better as soon as the human behavior looks as changeable as good old figure 6-3 tells us it is. So in that sense, I think there is general encouragement of that. Was there a specific study of it in the city? No, ma'am. And there are a lot of people in this room who I think you could talk into doing that study. Unfortunately, for reasons of both demography and geography, I'm not one of them.
Yeah, in the back.
To endorse my colleague Jens Ludwig here. So I'm Rosanna Ander with the University of Chicago, formerly with the Joyce Foundation, so I believe you know Debbie left. So my question, or actually my comment is, I think we have a really interesting opportunity. Gary McCarthy, who's now the police superintendent in Chicago, was obviously really involved in a lot of the stuff that was done at the NYPD. I think he was the deputy for operations and was very involved in the crime strategy. So he is adopting, I think, a lot of this stuff and trying to implement it in Chicago. So I think it'll be interesting and for all the researchers in the room to really look at what impact taking these strategies has in other cities. But one question I have is, Chicago, for every year for the last 10 or 15 years, has taken more guns off the street than New York City or Los Angeles. And I'm just curious if you have any idea why Chicago seems to have more guns or crime guns than New York or Los Angeles or other big cities.
Well, I can't tell you about Los Angeles there. I can tell you that the police department's priority for removing guns from the street in Chicago has been extremely high, and their production of handguns has been extremely high for at least 45 years. and up in the sort of 7,000 range in the 1960s and early 1970s. One of the reasons is there are a lot of handguns there. There are a lot more handguns per 100 citizens in Chicago than there is in New York City. New York was a very funny place, gun-wise, handgun-wise, in 1990. The number of apartments that had handguns was about as low here as in any big city in the United States. Phil Cook at Duke, using suicide shares, did some very good work on that. But if you looked at the percentage of New York City's peak rate homicides in 1990 that were committed with handguns, that was around 74%, and that was very high. So what you had is a thin layer of street guns. That meant, to address your question, that even if the police were doing a fine job, they would probably end up corralling fewer handguns than proportionally Chicago would. Now we've got to look at the bad news part of that with Chicago too. And that is that in order to maximize the number of guns in Chicago, and again this goes back 45 years, Chicago was not worried about perfecting gun prosecutions much in the 60s and 70s. It was worried about getting guns off the street. And what that meant was that the exclusionary rule was not a major deterrent to police hyper-aggressiveness there. Those traditions die hard, and I think that may also be a large part of the number difference.
Okay, one more question. Yeah, Jim?
Jim Lynch, Bureau of Justice Statistics. Frank, I'm really intrigued by the graph that you have up there because that's a massive, massive decline in recidivism that's up there, and so that's what makes me, anything massive makes me very suspicious. And so I'm thinking, I mean, it would be interesting to return to that and sort of decompose that graph, because I think a lot of it's going to be driven by drug offenders, how many of those are exiting, because their chances of recidivism are usually substantially higher than some of the other kind of offenders. But the other thing that strikes me is that, and this comes from some of the work that Al Bloomstein's doing, is that you have a New York City return rate. And to the extent that marginal populations, either through shifts in public housing or the housing market, have moved outside of New York, some of that recidivism, they may be coming back to places other than New York. And so if you're taking an exit cohort, someone's going to Westchester County or some other place, you know, they're going to give you a reduction in recidivism for New York because they simply...
No, not if they haven't moved out of state, because these are state, the solid line down here, the dotted line is probation returns, and may have some of that. The solid line is State Department of Corrections. So if Smith comes back to a New York prison, he's in.
But he's an exiting cohort, and suppose he exits to New York. Do you count him? And if he exits to Westchester, do you not count him as a New York exit?
Well, no, you sure do, because he's in the New York cohort the day he leaves prison, and he doesn't leave that cohort with regard to the recidivism statistic as far as the State Department of Prisons is concerned, if he's returned to prison.
If his admission address is New York, his exit address is Westchester County, where does he fall in that? Are you taking his admission residence, or are you taking his exit residence?
No, but they know who he is.
Yes, but if you're counting...
They're not tracking the city. Each one of these cohorts, they are tracking the individuals.
Right.
Where the problem occurs is New Jersey.
I'll try one more time, and I might be just sleep deprived. If it's their exit address or their entrance address, which are they using?
level
state?
data. not
No,
city.
but
Is it the whole state?
it was city recidivism that he has.
Where's Frida Solomon? This question may have an answer, we may
Yeah,
have
I
an
just
answer.
don't know.
Where's
If it's an
Frida?
exit address, you may
Yeah.
be affected by this movement to the
Correct.
outside.
Is Frida?
Yeah, I'm here, but I think that, Jim, can I ask you, are you asking, I think you need to just be more clear about New York City versus New York State.
Right. No, in other words, if that's a New York City cohort, and that, is it based on their admission, and it doesn't make any difference to where they were released, or is it based on their exit address, where you classify them as a New York? You'll have all their offenses that occurred in New York State, that's for sure. But the question here is how you classify them as in the New York City cohort, whether it's the admissions address or whether it's the release address.
So Frank, the question is, when you were doing this cohort, is the cohort a New York City, people who were admitted from New York City, and that's the answer to your question.
So that the only problem would then come, not if they changed their residence to other New York City areas and remained criminally active and were reincarcerated, but what if they went to other states? There are other indicators there, because there are a lot of prison returns that were not counted here. They also have technical violations. And actually the return rates are relatively stable. It is only the plausibly measured recidivism rates, the criminal activity rates, that have these big dips. And this one, by the way, is probation department data. And unfortunately is inferior because it's not convictions, it's felony rearrests. But it is, for its limited temporal period, about the same slope. And the point, let's go to the real point here, because what you're saying, Jim, is that this is a tremendous surprise. The level of individual criminal activity being that varied. And I would have to agree, I didn't think this data could be produced without a lot of extra expense. But if I were looking for, and there are two things about this graph that I want to tell a research audience. Number one, in terms of the received wisdom of criminology with regard to high-rate offenders, this is a huge surprise. Number two, if you want to do the math, you don't get 84% reductions in city-level robbery rates without any major population changes, unless there is, feeding that aggregate decline, something like this rather incredible surprise. But if I'm right about two of the arguments that I've made today, number one, this is what happened in New York, and number two, that New York is typical of urban crime in this potential, then this is what can be happening in lots of places. And this is a kind of a variability or contingency or susceptibility to situational influence, which should be of enormous interest and priority to the research of the people in this room. So I think it's the most important of these figures, given the reality of the declines that we started with in the first one.